right. CIS 75, module number 11. Working our way through the book. Going to get through chapter 13, which covers wireless and some mobile security. Security Plus assumes you have knowledge of the following methods. It's not that you have an in-depth knowledge, but you know they exist. For example, cellular, which if you don't know exists, that's kind of weird. Geographic areas are divided into cells, that's why it's called cellular, with long-term evolution, or LTE, and 4G and 5G networks. And the G stands for generation, if you did not know. Cell networks are secured, managed, and controlled outside of your organization, and traffic is set through that third-party network. You should treat this as an external network connection. And this is true. Using your cell phone to get out to the world from your organization is another way out. It's an external network connection. The problem with it is if there is a cellular device on the network, like let's say a hotspot or something else, that could allow an attack to enter that way, then through things like your router, which you already have a firewall for, and other detection systems. It's the equivalent of having a drum of water and having one way out to pour it, but then there's a leak on another side. So think of cell networks, or just the cellular network in general, as a possible leak to your infrastructure. There is, of course, Wi-Fi. Wireless fidelity relies on 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz radio bands, spanning multiple channels within those bands to allow multiple networks to exist. WPA 2 and 3 provide security frameworks for functionality to those networks, like encryption and authentication options. I have put this chart here in the slides. These are the things you need to know for the Security Plus exam. This is about as A+ as it's going to get, where when it comes to these things, it'll ask you which Wi-Fi standard goes with what frequency, or what goes with the maximum speeds. Next is Bluetooth, who also operates at 2.4 gigahertz, is low power, has a short range of about 50 to 30 meters, does not have high bandwidth, and connects peer-to-peer. Those are all important things that you need to know when you think about Bluetooth in the Security Plus exam. Bluetooth is easy to attack. It does support encryption, but Bluetooth depends on pins, like 4-digit pins that are easy to figure out or to brute force. Next is NFC, or near field communication. This is used for very short ranges, like 4 inches. You typically see this with things like Apple Pay or Google Wallet. All threats will be in close proximity. So like intercepting NFC traffic, replay attacks, spoofing, not responding to queries except when desired. NFC can be attacked. You just have to be right there. There's also radio frequency identification, or as you normally see it, RFID. This has relatively short range, under a foot for passive tags, 100 meters for active tags. It's used to exchange information. Active tags all have their own power source. RFID can be embedded in things like stickers, as small implantable chips, as tollway tags, and so on. These RFID tags can be cloned, they can be modified or spoofed, because most of them are never encrypted because the low power device doesn't really have enough power to do encryption. There are 3 frequencies that you need to be familiar with. And again, you don't have to have an in-depth knowledge of how the radio wave flows in the air. You just need to know that there is low, high, and ultra high frequencies. The low frequency RFID is used for entry access and identification, like this picture. It's not consistently used around the world. The high frequency can reach up to 1 meter, communicates more quickly, and has a read-only, write-only, and rewritable tags, which the low frequency doesn't. The ultra-high frequency is used in anti-theft purposes and has a much further range. Infrared is still around and still used. You use it with your remote controls. It works by line of sight. Infrared is most frequently used for point-to-point connections between devices. It doesn't have a high bandwidth and was replaced by Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Here are the different types of infrared that exist. So for the most part, if somebody really wants to transfer data, they're not going to use infrared. It's possible. It's just kind of clumsy because you have to be in line of sight. There is the global positioning system, using a constellation of satellites that send out GPS signals and received by compatible receivers. As with all the others that I have mentioned, they can be jammed or spoofed. Although interestingly enough, GPS jamming is illegal in the United States. And last, but certainly not least, as a connectivity method, USB. Since it allows mobile devices to mount its file system, to do updates, to do changes. Even though USB is a wired, it does grant access to wireless devices. So it would be listed. And you could also say, hey, I use USB to connect a Wi-Fi dongle, for example. Okay. The 3 major network models are the point-to-point, which is like Bluetooth and infrared. The point-to-multipoint, like Wi-Fi, where you have 1 access point, but 8 devices connected to it. Or broadcast, like GPS or radio. But let's jump into the attacks. How does an attacker attack a wireless network? Well, the first one is a rogue access point. This can be intentional or unintentional. A rogue access point is any access point that's been added to your network, either intentionally or not. Intentionally, for example, would be to bring a device called the Wi-Fi Pineapple, who can mimic another network or one that's similar. The Wi-Fi Pineapple can move between being an evil twin, which is a malicious fake access point with internet access set up to appear as a legitimate trusted network, or it can also be a rogue access point. the unintentional would be a employee of your organization doesn't like the Wi-Fi restrictions, like they have to input a long username, a long password, or have to use a certificate or whatever thing that they feel is convoluted to get wireless access. So what they do is they run over to Staples or Best Buy, buy a cheap access point, go into their office, set it up next to their computer, and now they have Wi-Fi for their phone and whatever else they bring. That is an unintentional rogue access point. Either one you got to deal with. Like I said, the evil twin pretends to be a legitimate access point or a legitimate network and gets users to connect. Though, if you have funding to play with, I suggest playing with it. Please note that the Wi-Fi pineapple is known in the hacker community, and there are tools to brick them. So if you think you are smart enough and you bring a Wi-Fi pineapple over to an event like DEF CON, know that somebody is going to brick it. Because they're more of an annoyance. If you have WPA2 in your home network, there's actually a lab on this that I'll talk about later, but for a long time, WPA2 was the uncrackable. It was secure. And then somebody brought in the key reinstallation attack and made WPA2 obsolete. When it comes to Bluetooth, we have the blue jacking, which sends unsolicited messages to Bluetooth-enabled devices, and blue snarfing, which is unauthorized access to a Bluetooth device, typically to gather information. So blue jacking is just an annoyance. Blue snarfing tries to gather information. The best defense against those two, and honestly the other three that I mentioned, is to turn off your wireless antenna when you don't need it. Now with Wi-Fi, digging a little further, we have three main ways: the disassociation, jamming, and initialization vector attacks. But disassociation, or as you would see it written out, deauth, sends a deauthentication frame to disconnect a legitimate device from its access point. Management frames are not encrypted in WPA2, giving the attacker an opportunity to capture information or set up an evil twin. WPA3 does have management frames encrypted. There's also jamming, who blocks all traffic in the range of the frequency. Jamming is unintentional and can often happen when two devices send signals in the same frequency at the same time. Because again, it's happening over the air. Nobody knows who's sending when. So you have a lot of collisions in the air. There's also the IV, or the initialization vector attacks. They're not a concern anymore in modern networks. It used to be the key way to attack the old school web by reverse engineering those IV vectors, or the initialization vector beacons, after capturing enough. So when thinking of designing a network, your Wi-Fi network must employ usability, performance, and security, which means you need to have careful planning of your access points as well as their configuration. You should conduct a site survey along the physical facility to determine the wireless signal strength and network soft boundaries, what channels are usable or what are overwhelmed, and where other AP devices can be placed. A Wi-Fi analyzer like this picture can help you create those heat maps, plan networks, conduct speed tests, and perform best channel mapping. I will point out that you don't have to have your Wi-Fi access point at 100% power all the time. The power is really speaking of range. Something that I suggest you do, and it's kind of part of the assignment this week, is to see how far your network access actually goes. Because we're using the air, there's a soft boundary. Right? Once the signal gets weak enough, it's inaccessible, so it basically becomes the soft end of your network. You don't need it to be 100% in order to use the full bandwidth. Bandwidth does not equal power. So if you go out with your cell phone and you're across the street and you still have access to your network, that might be a problem, because if somebody wants to launch an attack, they can just sit on the other side of the street, try to pwn your network, get into it, and send whatever they want on its way. And it looks like it came from your house rather than someone else's. Enterprise networks rely on wireless LAN controllers to manage their access points. They offer intelligence and monitoring, creating software-defined WVLANs, Wi-Fi and 5G roaming, evil twin and rogue AP detection, and so on. Small and medium-sized businesses tend to deploy standalone access points. Either way, properly securing controllers and access point is important. Things like changing the default settings, disabling insecure protocols or services, setting strong passwords, protecting administrative interfaces, make sure that the devices are all fully patched and updated, enable monitoring and logging. On the more expensive and advanced systems, you could enable threat intelligence, intrusion prevention, and other capabilities in parallel with other network tools that we've discussed in prior modules. So more things to add to your knowledge base. The Wi-Fi protected access to WPA2 is the widely deployed standard. It uses the counter mode cipher block chaining message authentication code protocol, or CCMP. CCMP uses AES to provide confidentiality and access control capabilities. Under WPA2, there are two main items that you need to remember: WPA Personal, which is WPA PSK, and WPA Enterprise. The Personal uses a pre-shared key to allow clients to authenticate without an authentication server infrastructure. You find these everywhere. You walk into Starbucks, they tell you, oh, this is the code to log in. Or at your house, you have a passphrase or whatever you have in order to get devices on your network. That's WPA Personal. WPA Enterprise relies on radius. Users have to have unique credentials and are uniquely identified. So connecting that to an authentication server in order to allow individual users access. Oops. A WPA3 has arrived, introduced in 2018. It improves like Personal by adding a simultaneous authentication of equals. It's a password-based authentication. It replaces those pre-shared keys by requiring client and network to validate both sides with unique passwords, therefore slowing down brute force attacks. There's also the perfect forward secrecy, a process that changes encryption keys on an ongoing basis. With enterprise networks, there is stronger encryption, authentication methods, and controls for deriving and authenticating keys and encrypting any network frames. So yes, WPA3 is better. And of course, in order to use it, you more than likely have to buy new devices. Hooray. Oh, this is a little further. Okay. Your wireless authentication protocols. 802.1x is the IEEE standard for access control and authentication in wireless and wired devices. Wi-Fi networks rely on EAP or Extensible Authentication Protocol variants, like the protected EAP, which uses a certificate using TLS tunnel. Devices on the network use unique encryption keys and a temporal key integrity protocol, or TKIP. There is the flexible authentication via secure tunneling extensible authentication protocol. These get long and weird, but EAP Fast is a Cisco developed protocol improvement over LEAP, LEAP. It uses shared secret for faster reauthentication and dynamic keys for public key authentication. EAP TLS is a certificate-based authentication on both client and network devices to generate keys. It's used less frequently due to management and deployment of certificates on a larger number of client devices. There's also EAP TTLS. It extends the prior one, doesn't require devices to have a certificate. EAP TTLS requires additional software, on the other hand, to be installed on some devices. Now, this slide shows you the mobile device deployment methods. These are some ways for you to deploy your mobile devices. It's either bring your own device where the user owns the device and has full control. That means they also have to maintain it. It may be lower cost to the organization, but it does mean greater risk because you don't have control over it. So you can't force updates. So you're going to have devices that aren't fully up to date on your network and may have a bug or two or three. There's the choose your own device where the organization owns the device, but allows the user to select what they want to maintain it. There's the corporate owned personally enabled device. It's owned and maintained by the organization, allows for some personal use, but the organization does control the device. And then there's a fully corporate owned, where it's a fully owned by the company. They manage it all. There is no way for you to use it for personal use. Mobile device management allows you to connect various devices together into a single management platform to maintain and keep up to date and be able to track where they go if they get lost. There's the mobile application management that focuses on any application deployed to mobile devices, anything from app delivery, configuration, update, version management, performance monitoring, analytics, logging, data gathering. You know, Big Brother. There's a number of key features that you need to be aware of with all the mobile device management tools. There's the management features, the content management, remote wipe, geolocation and geofencing. Geolocation just tracks the device. Geofencing allows the device to only work in certain places. So any user who has a geofence device has to be okay with the fact that you or anybody else who is controlling that mobile device management tool will know where they are in the world. MDMs or mobile device management can also have the controls for things like screen locks, biometrics, context aware. So it knows, hey, it's 6 p.m. You shouldn't be working. I'm going to kick you off. They have containerization in order to secure applications, store data, and have it as a separate container from everything else. They can do storage segmentation where personal and business data are on separate volumes and are encrypted. Full disk encryption and push notifications. Users they do try to get around all these controls by rooting or jailbreaking their devices so they can sideload programs or install custom firmware. The MDM tools can detect firmware updates and operating system patches to systems, as well as limit or prohibit the use of cameras, microphones, text, USB, depending on the configuration of the device, and include things like what Wi-Fi networks, Bluetooth, or NFC devices they can connect to. Carrier unlocking allows phones to be used with other cellular providers, which is always handled at the carrier level. Lastly, we have two mobile device security tools that are in the test. There's the micro SD hardware security module, hardware key management and public key infrastructure in small form factor for the micro SD, SIM and other formats. These hardware security modules can provide key encryption, backup and restore, management and support authentication, and other cryptographic tools requiring an app to use them. There is also SE Android. The security enhanced Linux for Android provides an ability to enforce mandatory access control on Android devices. SE Android allows processes to be containerized to limit exploits, as well as secure systems and services, any application and data logs, and other information based on what application is being used. Apple, of course, has its own file vault and enclave and whatnot. But interestingly enough, the Apple stuff is not mentioned in Security Plus. You will see SE Android, but you won't see the iOS stuff. Any questions? Okay, seeing no questions. The work this week is the following. The first question is your network on Wiggle? It's a database that word drivers use to find vulnerable networks or just any networks that they find and stick it on a map. Highly suggest going to this site, zooming in on your area, and see if somebody has found and detected your network. There is a way to get them off of the map, but it's never a for sure, because at any point, another word driver could pass by and add it back to the map. I just zoomed in a random location, but I would highly suggest zooming into your area and see if your network is on the list. And I want to zoom in to see the names of the networks. It's not showing me. No labels. Not sure why that's happening right now. Might be in my browser. But really, it's about doing some open source intelligence. Is your Wi-Fi network, your home Wi-Fi network on this database? And if so, can you get it off? Because again, if a malicious person wants to launch an attack, they just need to find a network that isn't theirs to connect to, launch their attack, and take off. And if your network is reachable across the street, how often do you check across the street to see who parks? Or how far could somebody park their car and still be able to see your network, connect to it, and do what they need and take off? This is where the whole setting the soft boundary for your network comes into play, because if it can be reached across the street, if your neighbor can still access your network, you might want to reduce the power. The second item is looking at the key reinstallation attack. There's tons of research now on this. See if your network device, your access point, is vulnerable to key reinstallation attacks and what you can do about it. A number of manufacturers release patches to avoid this vulnerability. But not everybody updates their router. Not everybody updates their access point because they don't think about that. It works, so what? But so what is huge when you can do this, which essentially what this did is in the four-way handshake, it would change everything. It would change the encryption key to zeros and allow essentially an open communication that anybody could see. It's pretty darn cool. Take a look. And hopefully your access point is not vulnerable. If it is, hopefully there are steps to fix, because really the only other fix is to buy a new device. So have fun with that stuff. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask on Discord as we continue our way through getting ready to take the Security Plus exam.